The coronavirus pandemic has really done a number on us. One of the ways it hurts a lot is the way it isolates us. It's atomized us and scattered us into our little boxy artificial environments, our homes, for those of us who are lucky to have permanent dwellings. And especially if you live alone, but even if you live together, you often don't get that close, intimate, visual and tactile and really good interaction with each other. We look at these two-dimensional representations of each other on computer screens, and we hear crackling, low-quality audio, and it's really just not the same. It's not even close to the resolution and the palpable, tangible presence of each other when we get to actually have a conversation or an interaction face to face. But the pandemic, that's just the latest development in a long history of loneliness and isolation and alienation in modern, but not only modern, but all human experience. So here are a few other, just a smattering of examples. The rise of the internet is a big one. The jury's still out on whether the internet brings us together or pulls us apart more in the final analysis. That it allows amazing collaboration, projects like Wikipedia, and obviously social media helped catalyze the Arab Spring protests and revolutions that achieved some good political progress for a lot of people. But we all know also how toxic social media can be and how discouraging the statistics are on how much people use just porn and TV and movies and gaming and especially isolated gaming, and how much people end up alone in their homes on the internet rather than using it to help come together and build community. Just one example is Sherry Turkle is a social researcher who's looked at this, and she has a TED Talk called Connected But Alone that surveys some of these trends, the ways in which social media really just give you shallow facsimiles of true relationships. So that's the internet. Good or bad, it certainly on one level has intensified the progression of separateness and loneliness, as a lot of technologies do. Technologies they often ramp up and intensify and raise the stakes of trends that are already latent and already trickling along. It's similar to the way that if you spend time in the countryside, then you go to a city, you see, everything in the city is more intense. Rural life and urban life. Urban life is a more concentrated and distilled version of, good and bad. The crime, the culture, the dirt, the aliveness, the beauty, the struggle. And that's only true in one sense. Life is just as real in the countryside, obviously. And I'm going to be a hayseed to the end of my days. I love it in the country. But that distinction mimics some of the way in which some of our technologies also increase the stakes. And when you're around, when the stakes are raised and when you're using, concentrated and distilled substances, you need to be that much more careful in how you use them, because it can be deadly. So that's the internet. But even before the internet, before internet culture, there was this great peak of American individualism and cowboy me first mentality that maybe in the 80s that peaked, and that's before my time, but Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam is maybe the seminal sociological tract, looking at the decline of American civic institutions and the family and all sorts of community and clubs and other ways that people used to get together. But even that is just a pretty recent chapter in a long history, perhaps especially psychologically and mythologically, since the very beginning of human experience. I'll get to that in a minute, but first, there's also a really devastating way that our basic assumptions nowadays about how business is done have also contributed to our social isolation. And here's what I mean. A lot of human economy, and by economy I mean what the word really means etymologically, which is management of the home, ekonomos. A lot of human economy was achieved through interdependent and reciprocal trading and sharing between family members and friends and neighbors. Your dad is a car mechanic, he teaches you how to work on your car, you do it together, your car's fixed. That has been replaced over centuries since the rise of commercialism and sort of commodified economic practices themselves with money and private property and other fundamental institutions that made that possible. As venality, everything for sale, everyone for sale, has just expanded over the centuries. Now our economy is dominated by transactional relationships, and those are very temporary and fleeting, and they don't encourage the sort of reciprocal trust-building behavior that you need in reciprocal and interdependent relationships. So instead of my dad fixing my car, I take it to the mechanic, and especially if I'm in a city and I have a lot of choice of mechanics, I have no reason to, I might be civil, and it's still always good to do that, but the incentives aren't there for people to maintain the relationship past the time you walk in the door, get the service and pay for it. And then you can do that every time, you walk into a store. You can increasingly, so many things can be just bought and sold. And that isolates us. That actually allows us to entrench ourselves and nest ourselves away in our little houses and live our lives pretty much alone, if we want to. And most people don't, but the epidemic of depressive illness and a lot of other mental health problems says that a lot of people are buckling under the pressures to the pressures that are separating us. Okay, so that's just one more example. Now you could trace this history all the way back, and it's a one-sided history. There's another side to the story, but you could trace this history of loneliness all the way back to the beginning. And the beginning, mythologically and religiously speaking, may be, from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, may be found at the very beginning when the fall from grace out of the Garden of Eden, when we were kicked out of paradise and we have this rise of self-consciousness and we realize, oh, I'm naked and alone and cold and ignorant and afraid. And a lot of us individually have that experience when you start to realize that, life is a solo journey. And that's true in a sense. On one level of analysis, that's very true. That you're utterly alone, and the longer you live, the more alone you realize you are. Because even your parents and your siblings and your spouse, you can spend years with someone and still not really know them, and they don't really know you. And the more you live, the more that becomes apparent, and that you're even alienated from yourself. So this is a horrible, excruciatingly painful dilemma and realization to have, that you're separated, you're cut off from your source. And what do you do about that? That's a really big question. Perhaps the highest and the deepest answer that our religious sages and a lot of the wisest people who've ever lived have uncovered to that dilemma, and it's really the answer to a lot more than that dilemma, but it certainly solves this problem of alienation. The answer may be to undergo and undertake this highest and deepest spiritual awakening, this journey of transformation and of waking up, in which you come to realize, and not just realize cognitively, but really experience the truth that you and the other are not separate. And that's a hard thing to say and to articulate in our limited language and to wrap your head around. But very few, if any, of us have ever done it. Maybe the Buddha or a few others. And it amounts to coming to all the time inhabit a whole nother plane of consciousness when you really do realize and live as though our separation is illusory, and we're just not separate from each other. We're not. There's a seamless whole with a capital W, wholeness of being with a capital B. That is the underlying truth, despite what our perceptions and contrary to all appearances. One example of an attempt to articulate this is found in Alan Watts' book called The Book, subtitled On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. And Watts, he just brilliantly interpreted a lot of Eastern wisdom for Western ears. But if that spiritual journey, that highest and deepest answer, is difficult, and it's maybe the most difficult thing for a mortal human being to do, in a way, to transcend our very limitations and to realize our non-separation with the rest of being and of existence. Well then, on the day-to-day, the quotidian, the mundane level, another way to tackle this question of alienation is to assert that even if life is a solo journey, well, it's not really, in a way, to say that, and to say, even if it is, it's well worth the attempt to cultivate relationships with others. And this is an area where it's cool that Western science and the old Eastern wisdom are actually converging. The journalist David Brooks wrote this book called The Social Animal, and that's a good exploration of a lot of Western scientific findings and the way that they show that, no, we're not separate. And human beings cannot thrive if we're kept isolated from each other. That it's actually, that the relationship between infant and mother actually forms the infant as an organism. And it's impossible to come to be as a human being without that connection. And it's certainly impossible later in life to thrive without it for almost everyone. So it's nice to know that science is on the side of connection. But a really good example of this realization that you need to build relationships, as difficult as it is. A really good example is found in Into the Wild by John Krakauer in the movie of the same name, about Chris McCandless, aka Alexander Supertramp. And McCandless, he's a paragon and a symbol of a lot of things, good and bad. The draw to the American wilderness, the iconoclasm of leaving the dirtiness and messiness and the turpitude of civilized life behind, and striking out for purity and beauty and truth in the wilderness. He's a representative of that. He's also representative of the impetuousness of the cowboy youth of America, and it got him killed. And he's also really a symbol of individualism, and that taken to its negative extreme as well. So in the story, he grows up on the eastern seaboard in the U.S. in the 80s perhaps, and he becomes disenchanted with it all, and the brokenness of his family, and the hypocrisy of so much life that he sees around him. And he just strikes out west, and he goes on this great odyssey, and he ends up in Alaska. Before he gets to Alaska, though, he has his first statement of individualism. At one point, he's talking to a guy out west, Ron something, I forget his last name, and McCandless says to Ron, "You don't need other people to be happy, Ron. God has placed it all around us. You can watch a sunset, or listen to music, or climb a mountain, or eat an apple, or watch a butterfly, or you can experience the beauty and the goodness of life and being without the need for other people. It's everywhere around us." And that's true to some extent. But McCandless, he took that as far as he could, and then farther than he could, because he ended up going to Alaska later, and he was living out in the wilderness, and He was beyond his means. He was way out beyond his area, beyond his competence, and he eventually starved to death out there, as you know if you know the story. And he came around in the end, and that's why this is such a profound example of the drive towards connection. And the very last words that he wrote, to our knowledge, before he starved to death were, "Happiness only real when shared." So he thought that everything he'd said before to Ron and all his experiences, they all come up short if they're experienced alone. And that may be, for most of us, the practical answer to the question of the separation and the solitariness of life, is that you have to fight against that. You just have to, by sticking in there and building relationships with people. And this is, the old cliche that, love conquers all, and it's this crowning force in humans that will win out in the end. And it's not, yes, happiness only real when shared, but it's not just about happiness, because you can't always be happy. And even the attempt to build relationships with people is full of struggle and of difficulty and sadness and sorrow. And that's one of the hardest things about love and about trying to connect with people, is the vulnerability involved. Brene Brown's work on vulnerability is really good if you're interested in exploring all that. Because, the temptation is there, and it's easy now. The temptation is there to just say, no, I'm not going to bother. It's hard to build relationships with other people, even friendships, much less close, intimate, romantic connections, and to deal with your family. It's easier and easier to go build a life alone. And we can go on the internet, we can meet almost all our needs by you work a job just to make money for yourself, and you use that money to, in these transactional business relationships, meet all your needs, and more than your needs, meet all your wants. Apparently, though, there's a falseness to a lot of it, right? When you try to commodify things, and it's easy to stay in our houses, and the square footage of houses has been growing over the decades. Houses are getting bigger and bigger, especially in America. So it's so easy to just retreat away from each other and just live life as an atomized individual. And there's a lot of good things to individualism. Solitude is great, and I really see its virtues, and have spent plenty of time trying to learn trying to come to a mature ability to get along with myself and be happy enough in your own company. That's a good thing too, and I'm not knocking that. But if that's all you have, people tend to go off the deep end. So, as good as solitude is, loneliness, which often attends solitude, is a deep and painful, fundamental problem. More than a problem, it's like an existential threat to trying to live life, to thrive as a human being. And the answer to that, short of pure spiritual enlightenment, may be the attempt to live as though we're in this together, because we are. And may not always make us happy, but it will make sharing the happiness we do find, will make it more real. And the difficulty and the struggle and the sadness we encounter can be rendered meaningful and can be redeemed by that attempt to live in recognition of the fact that we're all in this together.